enslaved Africans didn't come in one large group and stop coming and then, begin to create new ways of life in the Caribbean. Enslaved people kept being imported from African societies over the course of centuries. So this meant that there was a constant influx of African knowledge and experience and tradition into slave societies, especially in the Caribbean, where the demographics were such that there were many enslaved people being imported, and also because of the dangers associated with sugar production. It was so hard on the body, and so many people died that this meant that there was just vast numbers of people being imported. Whenever people could, they would gather with people from their own traditions and try their best to maintain what they knew. But there were obvious impediments to that. Many enslaved people didn't have the opportunity to be enslaved alongside people from the communities they were from. The incredible demands on people's time and labor and health and attention meant that they didn't have the resources, often physical, mental, otherwise, or material, to obtain the things they needed to create their music. So the main one being in the form of instruments. Very prominent instrument across many West African societies, the bala, this type of xylophone. It is a fairly intricate instrument to design and build, requiring specific types of wood and curing. They were made in the Caribbean. This is an instrument that survived in plantation societies, but it didn't thrive in the way that the banjo did. Banjos were much easier to reproduce and to make in the Caribbean. Another instrument that I think is interesting from mainland North America, not so much the Caribbean to my knowledge, although I'm sure there are examples. There's an instrument in parts of Mississippi and in the deep South and the U.S. known as quills, which is essentially a panpipe type of instrument. A panpipe is an instrument that crosses many cultures, actually, but it's called quills apparently because in the region of Africa where some enslaved people were from, this type of instrument was made with large porcupine quills. So then the term for the instrument, even though the material construction changes in the U.S., the terminology harkens to the original African instrument. Similarly, sounds, I believe, survive really persistently across into new instruments. So if you couldn't make your traditional type of zither or mouth bow, you would find a way to recreate that sound on another type of instrument. Richard Rath is a scholar who's studied this extensively and talks about how after drums and horns were banned, he essentially argues that enslaved people, because they were often encouraged to play the fiddle, especially later in the 18th century, that they brought some of their drumming patterns and techniques to the fiddle instrument. There's some somewhat rare techniques of fiddling in the U.S. South where people called beating straws or stick knocking, where they'll kind of tap along the stock of the fiddle while the fiddle player is playing. So I think this is a real where a lot of incredible ingenuity and innovation comes from African diasporic music. This method and technique for transferring sound styles and patterns from instruments to bodies. Another tradition is patting juba, and traditions where, and this is a tradition that still lives on, using one's body to kind of pat and make drumming patterns. This, of course, what do you do when you don't have a drum? You use your body to make a drum. And I think in thinking about your initiative and thinking of Afro-Irish connections, I think that this is an area that's kind of similar between, Irish music and African music. My understanding is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but in some Irish fiddling techniques are made to sort of make the fiddle sound like a pipe, or there's certain techniques or making a voice sound like a fiddle or a fiddle sound like the voice, this kind of way of taking the sound style and transferring it across instrument. Another example of this, of course, is scatting, which is a 20th century survival of this method of innovation, when the jazz singer uses their voice to imitate the instruments. These are really deeply historic traditions of sonic knowledge, and that transcend Africa and the diasporas. And I think something that's very unique within, even as some of the instruments and the specificities of the practices, had to adapt, made to adapt because of the cruel conditions of enslavement. But out of that, this, really strong technique and tradition of sonic innovation across instruments and voices and bodies emerges.